Dear listeners, please close your eyes gently. Imagine you're sitting around a warm, crackling campfire, and the Milky Way flows silently like a stream of diamonds in the night sky. Now, let's go back to a time when cowboys, outlaws, and vanishing wilderness belonged together. Our story begins with the diary of a man named Arthur Morgan and an unexpected act of kindness in the sunset. The sketch wasn't coming right. Arthur Morgan frowned at the page, his pencil hesitating above the half-finished drawing of a hawk in flight. There was something about the wings, the way they caught the high, thin air, that his rough, calloused hands couldn't seem to capture. He sighed, a quiet sound that was lost in the vast emptiness of the Dakota landscape, and he closed his journal. He watched the great river slide by, its surface a sheet of hammered gold in the late afternoon light. In the distance, a young buck, a beautiful and a perfect creature, appeared at the water's edge, its head raised, cautious and lovely. Arthur drew his rifle with a practiced and an almost thoughtless ease, the worn stock of the gun a familiar and a comforting weight in his hands. He lined up the shot, his breath held in the quiet stillness, and he squeezed the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed across the water, a sharp and a lonely and a final sound. Well, he muttered to himself, his voice a low and a gravelly sound, at least something's going right today. He hauled the heavy carcass onto the back of his horse, his mind already drifting back to the camp, and to the troubles that were brewing there. Dutch's latest plan, like all of his plans these days, had been gnawing at him since morning. It was another grand and a beautiful and a complicated scheme, a plan that was filled with too many moving parts, that relied too heavily on faith, and that was whispered into Dutch's ear by the poisonous and smiling lips of Micah Bell. Arthur needed the quiet. He needed the space to breathe, to think, to simply be, without someone asking him to be their fist, or their gun, or the strong and silent and unquestioning instrument of their will. He was turning his horse toward camp, the promise of a hot cup of coffee and the familiar, if often frustrating, company of his gang pulling him homeward, when he first heard the shouting. The homestead was a small and a simple and a beautiful thing, the kind of place that Arthur might have dreamed of building for himself, in another life, a life that had never been his to live. There was a modest cabin with a small, welcoming porch, a chicken coop, and a neat corral for a few horses. But the peace of this quiet place was being shattered by the presence of 3 riders, who were circling the yard like a pack of hungry wolves, their laughter a sharp and a cruel and an ugly sound in the clear, still air. They were kicking over crates of produce, their horses trampling the carefully tended rows of a small kitchen garden. And in the center of the yard stood a woman, her back as straight and as unyielding as a ramrod, her face a mask of quiet and defiant anger. And hiding behind her skirts, his small hands clutching the rough fabric, was a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, his eyes wide with a fear that no child should ever have to know. "Mrs. Vance," the lead rider called out, his voice carrying the false and cheerful and oily tone of a man who enjoys his work far too much. "Mr. Croft's patience is wearing mighty thin. Now, you just be a good and a sensible widow, and you sign the papers." The woman, Mrs. Vance, did not move. "This land is mine, Mr. Kane," she replied, her voice steady and clear, though Arthur could hear the tremor of fear that lay just beneath the surface. "My husband and I, we have the deed. We bought it, fair and square." Kane, a man with a cruel and a sneering mouth, dismounted from his horse and he began to walk slowly towards her, his spurs jingling with a soft and a menacing sound. "Deeds can be reinterpreted, Mrs. Vance," he said with a thin and an ugly smile. "Especially when a property has such valuable and such desirable water rights." "I'm not signing anything," she said, her voice now a quiet and a final whisper of defiance. The slap was a sudden and a vicious and an ugly thing. The sound of it seemed to hang in the still air. Mrs. Vance staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, but she did not fall. The boy cried out, a small and a helpless and a heartbroken sound. And Arthur Morgan, who had been watching from the quiet and shadowed tree line, did not remember making the decision to move. One moment, he was a distant and an uninvolved observer, a man who knew better than to get involved in other people's troubles. And the next, his horse was trotting at a slow and a steady and a deliberate pace toward the homestead, his hand resting with a quiet and an easy and a familiar weight near the butt of his revolver. "Looks like the lady said no," he said, his voice a soft and an almost conversational sound that seemed to cut through the tension in the air. "I think it's time for you to be on your way." Cain turned, his face a mask of annoyance that quickly shifted to a look of wary assessment as he took in the sight of Arthur. He saw the size of him, the quiet and dangerous confidence in his posture, the worn and well-used gun belt, and the cold, steady, and dead-eyed stare that had made better and more dangerous men than him reconsider their life choices. "This ain't your business, mister," Cain said, his own voice now lacking its earlier, easy arrogance. "Seems to me it ain't yours neither," Arthur replied, his own tone still light, almost friendly, but his eyes never left Cain's. "The way I see it, you're trespassing. And you're upsetting the lady." A long and a taut and a silent moment stretched between them, a moment that was as tight and as fragile as a bowstring. And then, Cain broke. He spat on the ground, his face twisting into an ugly and a resentful sneer. "Come on, boys," he said to his men. "Mr. Croft will want to hear about our new complication." He mounted his horse, and he leaned down from his saddle, his eyes filled with a new and a cold and a reptilian hatred. "We'll be back, Mrs. Vance," he said. "You can count on that." Arthur watched them ride off, the dust from their horses' hooves rising in a small and a golden cloud behind them. And only when they were gone did he finally turn and look at the woman. Her cheek was beginning to redden where Cain had struck her, but her eyes were clear and they were hard and they were filled with a quiet and a powerful and an unbroken dignity. "Thank you," she said, her voice a quiet and a simple and a profound expression of a gratitude that was deeper than words. Arthur simply nodded. "Ma'am," he said, and he tipped his hat, and he began to turn his horse to leave, his own part in this small and insignificant drama now, he believed, at an end. But the woman's voice called out after him. "I'm Laura Vance," she said. "And this is my son, Thomas." Arthur paused, his back still to them. He knew he shouldn't. He knew that names created connections, and that connections, in his world, were a dangerous and a foolish and a fatal liability. But he found himself stopping his horse. And he turned. "Arthur Morgan," he said, his own name tasting strange and unfamiliar on his tongue, a name that he had not offered to a stranger in a very long time. And the boy, Thomas, his fear now giving way to a child's natural and beautiful curiosity, asked a simple and a direct and a heartbreaking question. Will they come back, Mr. Morgan?" And the truth, the hard and the cold and the undeniable truth of his own world, a world of violence and of men like Cain and of men like himself, hung between them in the quiet and beautiful and fading light of the setting sun. "Yes," Arthur said at last, his voice a soft and a gentle and a terribly honest sound. "Yes, son. Men like that, they always do." And as he rode away, without looking back, the image of the woman and the boy, standing together in the dusty yard of their small and beautiful and fragile home, stayed with him, a quiet and an unwelcome and a strangely beautiful ember that had now begun to glow in the cold and the dark and the lonely and the empty and the long-neglected corners of his own weary and wandering soul. The camp was alive with the familiar and often chaotic energy of a small and restless community when Arthur Morgan finally rode in, the carcass of the buck slung over his horse and the heavy weight of his encounter with the Vance family settling into his bones. The air, which had been so clean and so quiet by the river, was now thick with wood smoke, with the smell of Pearson's perpetually simmering stew, and with the low, constant murmur of voices. Dutch, their charismatic and increasingly unpredictable leader, was holding court by the main fire, his voice a rich and a theatrical baritone as he spun another one of his grand and beautiful tales of a future that seemed, to Arthur, to be receding with every passing day. Micah Bell, his pale eyes gleaming with a sycophant's devotion, lounged at Dutch's side, his laughter always a little too loud, his agreement always a little too quick. This was home. But for the first time in a long and a loyal and a largely unquestioning life, Arthur felt like a stranger in it. He nodded a quiet greeting to the others, his usual gruff demeanor now a welcome and a necessary shield. He saw John Marston, sitting alone by his family's wagon, his face a mask of a quiet and a troubled thought as he watched his wife, Abigail, and his young son, Jack. The boy, who couldn't have been much older than the Vance's son, Thomas, was hunched over a piece of paper, carefully and seriously drawing a picture of the gang, a small and a heartbreaking and a beautiful little world of stick figures gathered around a campfire. And in that quiet and domestic scene, in the simple and beautiful and unattainable piece of it, Arthur saw a world that was a million miles away from the one that Dutch was now painting with his grand and his silver-tongued words. He saw a future, a real and a tangible future, and it was a future that he knew, with a deep and a growing and a painful certainty, was not meant for him, or for any of them, as long as they continued to follow Dutch's increasingly desperate and destructive path. Later that night, as the camp settled into an uneasy and a watchful sleep, Arthur found himself standing by the dying embers of a small, secondary fire with Hosea Matthews, the old and wise and weary con man who had, alongside Dutch, been a father to him. Hosea, his weathered face a beautiful and a tragic map of a long and a difficult and a glorious and a misspent life, looked at Arthur, his eyes filled with a sad and a knowing and a deep and a worried affection. "I've known Dutch for 20 long years, Arthur," he said, his voice a low and a quiet and a gravelly whisper. "I've never seen him like this. That business in Blackwater, it changed something in him. Or maybe," he paused, his gaze drifting towards Micah's tent, "maybe it just brought something out that was already there, something that I was too blind or too foolish to see." Arthur shifted his weight, the cold of the night air seeping into his bones. "We've had bad runs before, Hosea," he said, his own voice a low and an uncertain rumble. "We've always pulled through." "Not like this," Hosea replied, his voice now barely a whisper. "We are walking a dangerous path, Arthur. A path that is paved with Dutch's pride and with Micah's poison. And I fear that I am no longer strong enough, or wise enough, to lead him back from it." He placed a thin and a trembling and an almost fatherly hand on Arthur's broad shoulder. "Keep your eyes open, son," he said. "A storm is coming. And I'm not sure that all of us are going to be able to weather it." The old man's words, and the deep and profound sadness in his eyes, stayed with Arthur long after Hosea had shuffled away into the darkness. He looked around the sleeping camp, at the quiet and shadowy forms of the tents and the wagons, at the faces of the people who were his only family, a family that now seemed to be fracturing and breaking apart from within. He saw Bill Williamson, his loyalty to Dutch as simple and as absolute and as unquestioning as a dog's. He saw Javier Escuela, a man who was caught between his deep respect for the two men who had saved his life, his loyalty torn between the fiery, new vision of Dutch and the quiet, old wisdom of Hosea. And he saw Charles Smith, a man of quiet strength and of deep, moral integrity, a man whose eyes, like Arthur's own, were beginning to fill with a quiet and a dangerous doubt. A fissure was forming in the heart of their small and fragile world, a crack in the very foundations of their loyalty, and it was a crack that was growing wider and deeper with every one of Dutch's grand and increasingly reckless new plans. And Arthur Morgan, a man who had for so long been the strong and silent and unquestioning right hand of Dutch van der Linde, now found himself standing directly on the edge of this growing and dangerous and heartbreaking divide, his own heart a battleground of a deep and an old and a powerful loyalty, and a new and a quiet and a deeply unsettling and a dangerous and a profoundly personal sense of what was right and what was, so terribly and so tragically, wrong. The whispers in the camp were growing louder, and Arthur knew, with a cold and a certain and a heavy dread, that a time for choosing was fast approaching, a time when the simple and beautiful and powerful bonds of loyalty that had for so long held their world together would finally and irrevocably be put to the ultimate and most terrible of all possible tests. 3 days passed, each one a slow and a heavy and a quiet turning of the sun and the moon. The life of the camp continued its ragged and familiar rhythm. But for Arthur Morgan, something had fundamentally and irrevocably shifted. The old and easy certainties, the simple and powerful codes of loyalty that had for so long been the very bedrock of his existence, now felt like shifting sand beneath his feet. He found himself riding out from camp more and more often, seeking the quiet and the solitude of the great, open country. He told himself that it was just scouting, that he was just keeping an eye on the territory, watching for any sign of the Pinkertons or of the law. But he knew, with a deep and a quiet and an almost shameful honesty, that he was lying to himself. His horse, it seemed, had a mind of its own, and its path always, somehow, seemed to lead him back towards the small and lonely homestead of Laura Vance. And on the third day, as he crested a low and rolling hill that overlooked her small valley, he saw that his quiet and unspoken fears had been realized. He saw the cut fences, the wires snipped and torn, not by the random and clumsy passage of a wild animal, but by the clean and deliberate work of a pair of wire cutters. He saw the fresh boot prints in the soft mud by the riverbank, the deep and angry tracks of men who did not belong there. And he saw Laura herself, on her knees in the mud by the fence line, her hands raw and bleeding as she tried to mend the broken wires, her small and determined figure a lonely and a heartbreaking and a beautiful and a defiant silhouette against the vast and indifferent landscape. He had told himself that he would not interfere again. He had told himself that it was not his fight. But as he looked at the scene below, at the quiet and desperate and unyielding dignity of this woman, he found that he could not ride away. He dismounted, his heart a heavy and a complicated and an unfamiliar weight in his chest. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low and a quiet and a gentle sound. She looked up as he approached, her eyes, for a moment, filled with a flash of fear, a fear that quickly gave way to a weary and a grateful recognition. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice tight with a fatigue that was deeper than just physical exhaustion. "It seems you had some more visitors." "Every night now," she replied, her voice a quiet and a bitter whisper. "They don't do much. Just enough. They cut the fences. They scare the livestock. Last night, they poisoned the well." She gestured towards the small, stone-lined well near the cabin, and Arthur's stomach tightened into a cold and an angry knot. "Thomas," she said, her voice now barely audible, "he barely sleeps anymore. He just sits by the window, watching, waiting. Arthur knelt down and he looked at the fence, at the clean and professional way that it had been cut. And then he walked over to the well, and he looked down into its dark and still and silent water. "I'll clean it out for you, ma'am," he said, the words coming from a place within him that he did not quite recognize. "And I'll fix the fence properly this time." It took him the rest of the day. The work was hard and it was dirty, and the sun beat down with a relentless and a punishing intensity. But as he worked, as his hands grew sore and his back began to ache, a strange and an unfamiliar sense of peace began to settle over him. This was simple work. It was good work. It was work that was done not for a score, not for a plan, but for a reason that he could see and that he could understand. And as he worked, he began to wonder. What happens, dear listener, when the very people who are meant to uphold the law, to protect the weak and the innocent, are themselves the instruments of the cruel and the greedy? What does a good man, or even a man who is trying, in his own fumbling and imperfect way, to be good, do then? This was a question that Arthur had never really had to ask himself before. In his world, the world of the Van der Linde gang, the law was always the enemy, a corrupt and a hypocritical and an oppressive force to be fought against, to be outwitted, to be defied. But here, in this small and quiet valley, he was beginning to see something different. He was beginning to see that the line between the outlaw and the lawman was not always as clear and as simple as Dutch had always made it out to be. The next day, Arthur rode into the small and bustling town of Valentine. The sheriff's office smelled of stale whiskey and of cheaper tobacco and of the quiet and dusty and indifferent sweat of a law that had long since given up on the idea of justice. Deputy Miller, the same man who had been with Kane at the Vance homestead, barely looked up when Arthur entered, his attention fixed on the far more important task of cleaning his fingernails with a small and a grimy pocket-knife. "Help you?" he grunted. "Just passing the time," Arthur said, his voice a low and a casual and a non-threatening sound as he leaned against the wall. "Heard there might be some trouble out near Emerald Ranch Way. A homesteader, a widow named Vance, having some problems with her neighbor, a Mr. Silas Croft." Miller's eyes, which were small and hard and piggy, finally looked up, and they narrowed with a flicker of a cold and a reptilian intelligence. "Silas Croft is a respected businessman in these parts," he said, his voice a flat and a final and an uninterested sound. "He provides jobs. He pays his taxes." He pointed the tip of his pocket-knife at Arthur. "It's best that folks don't go meddling in what don't concern them." "Just asking is all," Arthur said, his own voice still quiet and easy. "Well, now you've got your answer," Miller said, and he returned his full and undivided attention to the great and important work of cleaning his fingernails. "Mr. Croft has got a proper and a legal claim to that water. The widow is just being stubborn, causing trouble for honest folk." Arthur tipped his hat, a gesture of a respect that he did not feel, and he left the small and dusty and airless office. And as he stepped back out into the bright and muddy street, he paused to light a cigarette, the small and familiar ritual a quiet and a comforting thing in a world that was suddenly feeling less and less familiar. The law would not help. He had not truly expected it to, but the cold and the casual and the absolute finality of it still settled in his chest like a hard and a heavy stone. He now understood, with a new and a stark and a terrible clarity, that Laura Vance and her son were truly and completely alone. And he knew, with a sense of a quiet and a dawning and an almost unwelcome certainty, that he could no longer just ride away. The invisible threads of a new and an unfamiliar and a dangerous responsibility were beginning to weave themselves around his heart, threads that were as fine as a spider's silk, but as strong as a hangman's rope. The life of a simple outlaw, a life of taking what you wanted and of caring for no one but your own, was beginning to feel like a distant and a faded and a beautiful and a long-lost dream. And in its place, a new and a more complex and a far more dangerous reality was beginning to take shape, a reality that would force him to choose, once and for all, what kind of man he truly was. The days that followed Arthur's tense and unsatisfying encounter in Valentine were quiet ones, but it was a heavy and a watchful kind of quiet. He returned to the Vance homestead, his presence now a silent and an unspoken promise. He reinforced the fences, his hands, which were so accustomed to the cold, hard steel of a gun, now relearning the simple and honest language of the hammer and the post. He cleaned out the well, hauling up the fouled water bucket by bucket, his face a grim and an unreadable mask. He did not speak much. And Laura Vance, in her quiet and intuitive wisdom, did not ask him to. She would simply bring him a dipper of clean water from the house, or a plate of warm food, and they would sit together on the porch in the long, quiet evenings, watching the sun set over the hills, a silent and a strange and a fragile companionship forming between them, a companionship that was built not on words, but on a shared and a quiet and a mutual understanding of the harsh and often unjust nature of the world. But Arthur knew that this could not last. He could mend the fences, but Cain and his men would simply cut them again. He could clean the well, but they would find new and more cruel ways to poison it. He was treating the symptoms, not the disease. The disease was Silas Croft, a man of wealth and of power, a man who had the law in his pocket, a man who believed that the world, and everything in it, was his for the taking. And Arthur knew, with a cold and a weary certainty, that the only way to fight a man like Croft was to fight him on his own terms. But how? How could a single, lonely outlaw, a man with a price on his own head, stand against a man who owned the very land they stood on, and the very law that was supposed to protect it? The answer came to him one night, as he sat alone by his own small campfire, staring into the dancing flames. He thought of Dutch, of the old Dutch, the Dutch who had raised him, the Dutch who had taught him that sometimes, the only way to fight a corrupt and a broken system was to operate outside of it. He thought of all the years they had spent as thieves, as outlaws, taking from the rich and, as Dutch had always claimed, giving to the poor. But had they ever really done that? Or had they simply taken, for themselves, for the gang, for the dream of a new and a better life that always seemed to be just over the next horizon, a dream that never, ever, seemed to get any closer? And as he looked up at the vast and the silent and the star-dusted sky, a new and a dangerous and an almost exhilarating idea began to form in his mind. He would not be a protector. He would not be a guardian. He would be what he had always been. He would be a thief. Silas Croft's ranch, the Emerald Ranch, was a sprawling and an impressive and an almost obscene display of wealth and of power. Its great, main house stood proud on a gentle rise, its windows glowing with a warm and a prosperous light. And surrounding it were a series of large and well-maintained storehouses, great barns that were filled with all the things that a small and a struggling homesteader like Laura Vance so desperately needed. There was feed for the chickens, there was medicine for the livestock, there were tools, and there were precious and expensive seeds for the spring planting. Arthur watched the ranch for 2 long and quiet nights, his eyes memorizing the routines of the guards, the layout of the buildings, and the slow and predictable rhythm of the comings and goings. And on the 3rd night, under the pale and slender sliver of a new moon, he made his move. He moved like a shadow, a ghost in the darkness, his feet making no sound on the soft earth. He had done this 1,000 times before. It was a familiar and a deadly and a beautiful dance. He disabled the single, sleepy guard at the back of the main storehouse with a quiet and an efficient and a practiced ease, a soft and a gentle and a final whisper of cloth and of leather. He picked the simple lock on the storehouse door, the metal tumblers clicking over with a sound that was as quiet as a sigh. And he stepped inside, into the cool and the dark and the fragrant interior, the air thick with the smell of hay and of grain and of a wealth that had been built on the suffering of others. He worked quickly and with a quiet and a professional precision. He filled a single, large sack with only the things that Laura and her son so desperately needed. Just enough. Not so much that it would cause a great and an immediate uproar, but just enough to give them a fighting chance, enough to allow them to survive through the coming winter. He delivered the supplies under the deep and silent cover of the darkness, leaving the heavy sack on the front porch of the small cabin, a quiet and an anonymous gift from a thief in the night. And as he turned to leave, as he prepared to melt back into the shadows from which he had come, a soft and a gentle light suddenly bloomed in the window of the cabin. And the door opened. And Laura Vance stood there, her face a beautiful and a complex and a deeply moving mixture of surprise, of confusion, and of a dawning and a profound and a beautiful understanding. "Stay," she said, her voice a quiet and a simple and a powerful invitation. "It's late. And I've made stew." He knew he should have refused. He knew that he should have mounted his horse and ridden back to the camp, back to the life that he knew, the life of a lonely and a wandering and a dangerous man. But he found that he could not. And so, he found himself sitting at her small and simple and beautiful wooden table, the warm and savory steam of the stew rising to meet him. And across from him, young Thomas, his eyes now free from the haunted and a fearful look that had for so long filled them, was demonstrating how to carve a small and a simple wooden horse, his small hands working with a clumsy and a beautiful and a deeply serious concentration. "My papa," the boy said, his voice a quiet and a proud and a slightly sad sound, "he used to do it better. But I'm still learning." "It's good, son," Arthur said, his own voice rough with an emotion that he did not quite understand. It's probably better than I could do." And later that night, after the boy had finally fallen asleep, Laura sat across from Arthur, her face golden and beautiful in the soft and gentle light of the single oil lamp. "You're not just passing through, are you, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, her voice a quiet and a direct and a deeply knowing sound. And Arthur, for the first time in a very long time, could not bring himself to lie. He looked down at his own rough and calloused hands. A killer's hands. A thief's hands. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice a low and a quiet and a final admission. "I reckon I'm not." "What are you, then?" she asked, her gaze steady and clear and unafraid. And the truth, the hard and the cold and the ugly and the simple truth of his entire life, pressed against his teeth, wanting out. What was he? He was an outlaw. He was a thief. He was a killer. He rode with the Van der Linde gang. He was no different, not really, from the very men he was now fighting against. But he could not say these things to her. He could not bring the darkness of his own world into the small and beautiful and fragile light of hers. And so, he looked up, and he met her eyes, and he said, with a quiet and a simple and a deeply felt honesty, I'm just someone who's seen too many people like Mr. Croft get their way." And she studied his face for a long and a quiet and a thoughtful moment. And then, she smiled, a small and a tired and a beautiful and a genuine smile. "Well," she said, her voice a soft and a gentle and a final and a beautiful sound, "whatever you are, Arthur Morgan, I'm glad that you found us." And in that single, quiet moment, in that small and simple cabin, surrounded by the vast and the dark and the silent and the often dangerous wilderness, Arthur Morgan, the outlaw, the thief, the killer, felt something that he had not felt in a very long, and a very lonely, and a very weary time. He felt, for just a moment, like he was home. The dawn that followed Arthur's quiet and anonymous act of thievery was a beautiful one. A soft and a gentle and a profoundly peaceful light spread across the great valley, and for the first time in a very long time, Laura Vance and her son, Thomas, awoke not to the sound of fear, but to a sense of a new and a fragile and a beautiful hope. The sack of supplies that had been left on their porch was more than just food and medicine, it was a sign. It was a quiet and a powerful and an unspoken promise that they were not entirely alone in this vast and often unforgiving world. But the fragile peace of this new morning was not destined to last. As the sun rose higher in the sky, a new and a far more dangerous kind of visitor arrived at the small and lonely homestead. It was Deputy Miller, his face a mask of a smug and an official and a self-righteous authority. And with him were two of Silas Croft's men, their hands resting with a casual and a menacing confidence on the butts of their guns. "Mrs. Vance," Miller called out, his voice a loud and an unwelcome and a jarring sound in the quiet morning air, "I've got a report of some stolen property. An anonymous tip suggests that we might find it right here, on your land." And Arthur, who had been sitting on the porch, quietly repairing a loose board, a simple and an honest and a peaceful task, slowly straightened up, his own face a calm and an unreadable and a deeply dangerous mask. The deputy's eyes flickered as he saw Arthur, a brief and an almost imperceptible flash of surprise and of fear, a look that was quickly replaced by a new and a harder and a more determined arrogance. "Morgan," he said, his voice now a little tighter, a little more strained. "What are you doing here?" "Just helping out a friend," Arthur replied, his own voice a low and a quiet and a deceptively casual sound. And he stepped down from the porch, his large and powerful frame positioning itself, almost unconsciously, between the lawman and the woman who now stood in the doorway of the cabin, her face pale but her eyes filled with a new and a defiant and an unwavering fire. "Is there a problem with that, Deputy?" Arthur asked. "I've got a warrant to search these premises," Miller said, and he produced a folded piece of paper from his pocket, waving it in the air like a small and a tattered and a deeply unconvincing flag. "Now, you stand aside, please." "Let me just check that," Arthur said, and he took the warrant from the deputy's hand. He unfolded it with a slow and a deliberate and an almost theatrical care. And as he had suspected, it was a vague and a hastily written and a probably not even legal document. But Miller had the badge. And Croft's men had the guns. And in this world, Arthur knew, that was often all the law that a man needed. "What exactly are you looking for, Deputy?" Laura asked, her own voice now steady and strong, her fear hidden behind a wall of a quiet and a powerful and a righteous anger. "Stolen goods, ma'am," Miller said with a thin and an ugly smile. "Farm equipment. Maybe some livestock." And he nodded to his two companions. "Search the place," he commanded. "Wait," Arthur said, and he stepped forward, his own voice now carrying a new and a hard and a dangerous edge. "You know this is Croft's doing. You know there's nothing stolen here." "I've got a duty to investigate, Morgan," Miller said, his own hand now inching almost imperceptibly towards his own gun. "Unless..." He paused, his small and piggy eyes shifting meaningfully towards Laura, "unless the widow here is reconsidering Mr. Croft's very generous offer." "Get off my land," Laura's voice was now as cold and as hard and as sharp as river ice in the dead of winter. "Now." But it was too late. One of Croft's men emerged from the small barn, dragging something behind him. "Found this, deputy," he called out, and he held up a beautifully tooled and an obviously new and an expensive-looking branded bridle. Croft's mark, plain as day. And Deputy Miller, his face now a mask of a triumphant and a false and a deeply rehearsed surprise, smiled his thin and his ugly and his final smile. "Well, well," he said. "Looks like we have our thief." "That's not mine," Laura protested, her voice now a mixture of a desperate anger and a dawning, terrible understanding. "I've never seen it before in my life. Someone planted it there." "A likely story," Miller said with a dismissive wave of his hand. And he gestured to his men. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice now filled with a deep and a false and a profoundly satisfying sense of official and legal authority, "you are under arrest for." The sound of Arthur's gun being cocked was a quiet and a simple and a deadly and a final sound, a sound that seemed to freeze the very air itself. Every man in the small yard stopped. And they turned. And they looked at Arthur Morgan. And he said, his own voice now a low and a quiet and a terrifying and a final whisper, "No. She's not." What do you think happens in a moment like this, dear listener? A moment when the law itself becomes the very instrument of injustice? It is a moment of profound and a terrible and a beautiful and a deeply human choice. It is a moment when a man must decide what he truly stands for. "You're interfering with the law, Morgan," Miller said, his own voice now a little shaky, a little less certain. "I'm preventing a frame-up," Arthur replied, his eyes as cold and as hard and as gray as a winter sky. "That bridle wasn't in that barn yesterday. I'd bet my life on it. And I'd bet it ain't even really Croft's. Just something with his brand slapped on it to make it look official." "Are you threatening an officer of the law?" Miller blustered, his hand now hovering, uncertainly, over the butt of his own gun. "I'm stating the facts," Arthur said, his voice still a quiet and a deadly and an unmoving whisper. "And now, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. You and your friends are going to get on your horses. And you are going to ride away. And you are going to tell Mr. Silas Croft that if he wants this land, if he truly wants it, he's going to have to come for it himself. And he's going to have to come through me." The standoff stretched on for a long and a silent and a seemingly eternal moment. The only sound was the quiet and gentle whisper of the wind in the tall grass, and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk circling high overhead. And then, once again, the lawman broke. Miller, his face now a mottled and an ugly and a fearful mixture of a deep and a burning anger and a profound and a humiliating and an undeniable fear, backed slowly away. "This isn't over," he warned, his voice now a weak and an impotent and a pathetic sound as he fumbled to get back on his horse. "Croft won't stand for this." Arthur watched them go, his own face a mask of a cold and a quiet and a righteous and a deeply satisfying fury. And as their horses disappeared over the far ridge, he looked at Laura Vance, who was standing there, her own eyes now filled with a mixture of a deep and a profound and a beautiful and a slightly terrified gratitude. "I'm counting on it," Arthur said, his voice now a quiet and a simple and a final and an unbreakable promise. "Ma'am. I'm counting on it." The quiet that followed Deputy Miller's humiliating retreat was a fragile and a temporary thing, as thin and as brittle as a sheet of ice on a winter morning. Arthur knew it. Laura Vance knew it. And even young Thomas, his eyes now filled with a new and a quiet and a sober understanding of the world, seemed to know it too. The immediate threat had passed, but the great and shadowy form of Silas Croft still loomed over their small and beautiful valley like a gathering storm cloud. Arthur spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet and focused industry. He reinforced the corral, he patched the roof of the small cabin, and he taught Thomas how to properly hold and to aim a small hunting rifle, his own hands gentle and patient as he guided the boy's small ones. But all the while, his mind was 1,000 miles away, turning over the pieces of the puzzle, searching for a way out of this impossible and ever-tightening corner. He knew that Croft would not be deterred by a single, armed man. He was a man of immense wealth and of even greater pride, a man who was not accustomed to being told no. He would be back. And the next time, he would not come with a single, corrupt deputy and 2 clumsy thugs. He would come with an army of his own, a private force of hired guns who would not be so easily intimidated. Or worse, he would use his wealth and his influence to turn the full and terrible and righteous-seeming weight of the law against them, a law that he had already proven he could buy and could bend to his own will. The standoff on the porch had been a victory, a small and a satisfying one, but it was a victory that had only served to escalate the conflict, to raise the stakes, and to make the final and inevitable confrontation even more dangerous. As night fell, a deep and a profound and a heavy silence settled over the small homestead. Laura put her son to bed, her quiet and gentle and humming voice a soft and a beautiful and a heartbreaking sound in the stillness. And Arthur sat alone on the porch, his gun resting on his lap, his eyes scanning the dark and silent and watchful tree line. He was a man who was accustomed to the long and lonely and often dangerous nights of the wilderness. He was a man who could read the stars, who could understand the quiet and secret language of the wind. But tonight, the familiar and comforting sounds of the night brought him no peace. He felt trapped, not by the physical landscape, but by a new and an unfamiliar and a deeply unsettling sense of responsibility. He looked at the small and simple cabin, at the single, warm, and golden light that glowed in its window, a small and a fragile and a beautiful beacon of warmth and of life in the vast and indifferent darkness. And he knew, with a deep and a quiet and a painful certainty, that he could not simply ride away. And so, the question that had been haunting him for days now returned with a new and a powerful and an unavoidable urgency. How do you fight a man who owns the world? How do you fight a man who can turn the very law itself into his own personal weapon? And the answer that came to him, in the quiet and the solitude of that long and sleepless night, was a simple and a dangerous and a deeply familiar one. You do not fight him with honor. You do not fight him with righteousness. You fight him with the only language that a man like that truly understands. You fight him with cunning, with secrecy, and with theft. You fight him not as a hero, but as an outlaw. You fight him as Arthur Morgan. He waited until the moon had sunk below the western ridge, until the entire valley was plunged into a deep and a profound and an almost total darkness. And he moved. He moved like a shadow, a ghost in the night, his feet making no sound on the soft, damp earth. He saddled his horse, his movements quiet and practiced and economical. And he rode out, not towards the camp, not towards the life that he knew, but towards the great and sprawling and arrogant heart of his enemy's empire, the Emerald Ranch. His plan was a simple and a desperate and a foolishly dangerous one. He knew from his brief and tense conversation with Deputy Miller, and from the quiet whispers he had gathered in the saloons of Valentine, that Croft's entire and so-called legal claim to the Vance's land rested on a series of documents, of falsified deeds, of corrupted maps, and of bribed testimonies. And he knew that a man as arrogant and as meticulous as Silas Croft would keep these precious and incriminating documents close, most likely in his own private office in the great, main house of the ranch. And Arthur was going to steal them. It was a plan that was born of a deep and a quiet and a desperate and a righteous and a beautiful and a terrible and a very personal kind of rage. It was the rage of a man who had for too long watched the strong and the greedy and the cruel devour the weak and the gentle and the good. The Emerald Ranch was a fortress, its perimeter patrolled by armed and watchful guards. But Arthur had spent a lifetime learning how to move through such places unseen. He used the darkness and the terrain to his advantage, his movements as silent and as fluid as the river itself. He slipped past the sleeping ranch hands in their bunkhouse, his heart a slow and a steady and a powerful drum in his chest. He disabled the single, drowsy guard at the back of the great house with a quiet and an efficient and a final and a deeply regrettable ease. And he picked the lock on the great, oaken door of Croft's private office. The room was a shrine to a man's immense and all-consuming ego. It was filled with heavy, dark, and expensive furniture, with shelves of leather-bound books that had likely never been read, and with the mounted heads of the magnificent and beautiful animals that Croft had hunted and had killed for sport. Arthur lit a small and a hooded lantern, its flame kept low, and he began to search. He moved with a quiet and a practiced and a desperate urgency, his hands searching every drawer, every cabinet, every hidden compartment. And then, he found it. In a heavy, locked drawer of the massive desk, he found a secret compartment. And inside, there was a small, leather-bound satchel. And inside that satchel was everything. The falsified deeds. The altered maps. And a series of letters that detailed, with a cold and a damning and a beautiful precision, Croft's entire and long-standing conspiracy to steal Laura Vance's land, a conspiracy that involved not just bribes and intimidation, but also a quiet and a damning and an undeniable correspondence with the very same Deputy Miller who was supposed to be upholding the law. Arthur was just folding the last of these precious and incriminating documents into his own satchel when he heard it. A quiet and a soft and an almost imperceptible creak of a floorboard just outside the office door. He doused the lantern, his own hand moving with a speed and an instinct that was born of 1,000 other dangerous and sleepless nights. And he drew his gun, the cold, hard, and familiar weight of the steel a strange and a comforting and a deeply familiar presence in his hand. And he waited. He waited in the darkness and in the silence, his own breath a loud and a ragged and a betraying sound in his ears. The door began to open. A long and a dark and a menacing shadow began to fall across the floor. The sleepless night was not yet over. The time for stealing the truth had ended. And the time for paying its terrible and often bloody price was about to begin. The world narrowed to the sound of a single, slow, and deliberate creak of a floorboard. In the deep and profound darkness of Silas Croft's office, Arthur Morgan stood as still as a statue, his entire being a single, coiled spring of deadly and a watchful tension. The faint and silvery starlight that filtered through the great, glass window was just enough to silhouette the large and menacing form of a man who now stood in the doorway. It was Cain. His face, in the faint light, was a bruised and a swollen and an ugly mess from their last encounter, and in his hands, he held a double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles like two dark and empty and soulless eyes, staring directly at Arthur's heart. A slow and a cruel and a deeply satisfied clap echoed through the silent room. "Well, well," Cain said, his voice a low and a gravelly and a triumphant sound. "Mr. Croft said we might have a visitor tonight. But I have to admit, I didn't think you'd be quite this foolish." Arthur remained silent, his own revolver held low and loose at his side, its cold, hard steel a familiar and a strangely comforting weight in his hand. He could feel his heart, a slow and a steady and a powerful drum in his chest. He was not afraid. He had been in 100 rooms just like this one, with 100 other men just like Cain. This was his world. This was the dark and deadly and beautiful and terrible dance that he had been dancing his entire life. "Just returning something that doesn't belong to your boss," Arthur said at last, his own voice a quiet and a calm and a deeply dangerous whisper. "Funny," Cain replied, and he took a slow and a deliberate and a menacing step into the room. "I was about to say the same thing about that pretty little widow's land." He gestured with the shotgun. "Move away from the desk," he said. "And put your hands where I can see them." Arthur complied, his movements slow and deliberate and graceful, his mind a quiet and a whirring and a beautiful and a deadly machine, calculating the distances, the angles, the chances. And he knew, with a cold and a clear and a final certainty, that the chances were not good. The shotgun would cut him in half at this range. "Mr. Croft wants to have a little talk with you," Cain said, his ugly smile spreading across his bruised face. "He wants you to explain his possessions to him. In person." "I'd be obliged if you'd take me to him then," Arthur said, his own voice still a quiet and an almost conversational sound. "Oh, he's coming," Cain said with a low and a guttural and a deeply unpleasant chuckle. "He's just getting dressed. Can't meet an important visitor in his nightshirt, now can he? But in the meantime," he said, and he raised the shotgun just a fraction of an inch, "you and me, we've got some unfinished business." And Arthur saw it then, in the man's small and hard and triumphant eyes. He saw the lie. Croft wasn't coming. Cain wasn't planning to wait for his boss. He was going to shoot him right here, in the dark, and he was going to claim that it was self-defense. It was a simple and an ugly and a cowardly plan, the kind of plan that a man like Cain would think was clever. And Arthur tensed, his body ready to move, to dive, to do something, anything, to try and cheat the terrible and the inevitable and the final and the all-consuming blast of the shotgun. But a man cannot outrun a bullet. Have you ever been in a moment like that, dear listener? A moment when time itself seems to slow down, to stretch, to become a thick and a heavy and an almost tangible thing? A moment when you can see the end, the final and the absolute and the undeniable end, coming for you? It is a moment of profound and a terrible and a beautiful and a deeply human clarity. But just as Cain's finger was beginning to tighten on the trigger, just as the entire world had narrowed to the two dark and empty and soulless eyes of the shotgun, a new and an unexpected and a beautiful and a life-saving sound entered the room. The quiet and almost imperceptible creak of a floorboard, just behind Cain. And in that single, split second of a distraction, as Cain's own eyes flickered for just a moment towards the new sound, Arthur moved. He moved with a speed and a grace and a deadly and a beautiful precision that was almost supernatural. He dove to the side, and the world erupted in a great and a deafening and a thunderous roar. The shotgun blast, which had been meant for his heart, instead tore a great and a splintering hole in the magnificent and expensive and imported bookshelf behind him. And as Cain was struggling to recover from the recoil of his own weapon, Arthur was already on him. He slammed into the larger man with the full and the powerful and the unstoppable force of his entire body, and the two of them crashed to the floor in a great and a tangled and a desperate and a violent and a deeply personal and a final embrace. The fight was a brutal and a silent and a deeply intimate thing, a dance of grunts and of curses and of the wet and ugly sound of fists on flesh. Cain was strong, but Arthur was smarter, and he was faster, and he was fighting not just for his own life, but for the life of the woman and the boy who were now, for some strange and beautiful and unknown reason, depending on him. He drove his elbow into Cain's throat, and he felt the man's breath leave him in a great and a ragged and a desperate gasp. And as Cain was struggling for air, Arthur saw something that made his own blood run cold. He saw the glint of a long and a sharp and a deadly knife in Cain's hand. But just as Cain was raising the knife for the final and the terrible and the killing blow, a new and an unexpected and a beautiful and a life-saving actor entered the stage. A shadow detached itself from the doorway, and a heavy and a beautiful and an ornate porcelain vase shattered against the back of Cain's head. The man grunted, a sound of a profound and a final and a complete and an utter surprise, and his eyes rolled back in his head, and his grip on the knife loosened. And Arthur, in that single and beautiful and miraculous and final moment, wrenched the shotgun from Cain's nerveless fingers, and he brought the heavy, wooden butt of the gun down, with a sickening and a final and a deeply satisfying thud, on Cain's temple. And the man went limp. Arthur scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in great and ragged and painful gasps. And he looked at the doorway. And standing there, her own eyes wide with a mixture of fear and of a fierce and a beautiful and an unshakable resolve, was Laura Vance. "I couldn't let you do it alone," she said, her voice a quiet and a trembling and a powerful whisper. And in that moment, the shouts began to erupt from outside. The gunshot had alerted the entire ranch. "We need to move," Arthur said, his voice now a sharp and a clear and a commanding sound. "Now." He grabbed the satchel of documents with one hand, and Laura's hand with the other. And they ran. They ran through the great and darkened house, as gunfire erupted behind them, the sound of bullets splintering the wood of the doorframes near their heads. They burst out a side door and into the cool and the dark and the beautiful and the forgiving night. Arthur returned fire, his shots precise and economical, not to kill, but to slow their pursuers, to give them the precious seconds they needed to reach the trees where their horses were waiting. They mounted, and they galloped into the darkness, the sounds of Silas Croft's own voice, now a high and a thin and a reedy sound of pure and impotent rage, rising behind them, promising a great and a terrible and a final and a bloody reward for their heads. But they were gone, two shadows, two fugitives, two unlikely allies, disappearing into the vast and the silent and the beautiful and the welcoming darkness of the great and open and American night. The truth had been stolen. And the battle for a small and a lonely and a beautiful homestead was about to become a war. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft and beautiful shades of rose and of pearl as Arthur and Laura finally rode back into the small, quiet valley. They were exhausted, they were bruised, and their clothes were stained with the dirt and the grime and the memory of the long and terrible night. But in the leather satchel that was slung across Arthur's shoulder, they carried the truth. They carried justice. The stolen documents, the falsified deeds, and the damning letters were now spread out on the small, wooden table of the Vance homestead, a quiet and a powerful and an undeniable testament to the greed and the corruption of Silas Croft and his puppet lawmen. "These will stop him," Laura said, her voice a mixture of a deep and a profound and a weary relief and a new and a fragile and a beautiful hope. "The circuit judge, he passes through Valentine next week. He's not in Croft's pocket. Not yet, anyway." Arthur nodded, wincing as she gently cleaned the long, shallow bullet graze on his arm. "You should leave today, ma'am," he said, his voice a low and a serious and a deeply concerned sound. "Take Thomas, and you go somewhere safe. Somewhere Croft can't find you. At least until the judge arrives." "And what of him?" He knew, with a deep and a heavy and an almost sorrowful certainty, that he had already stayed too long. His own people, his own family, would be looking for him now. Dutch would have questions. And there was still the matter of that bank in Valentine, the one that Dutch had been eyeing for weeks, the one that was supposed to be their one last score, the one that would finally give them enough money to disappear, to buy that small piece of land in a place where no one knew their names, a place where they could finally be free. That old and beautiful and ever-receding dream. He looked at Laura, at the strength and the dignity in her tired eyes, and at the small wooden horse that young Thomas had carved for him, which now sat on the mantelpiece, a small and a powerful and a beautiful and a deeply personal symbol of a different kind of life, a different kind of man that he might have been. "I'll be all right," he said, his voice now a quiet and a final and a deeply gentle sound. "But you take care of yourself, and of the boy." And as he finally mounted his horse and rode away, the image of her standing on the porch, her hand raised in a quiet and a silent and a beautiful and a final farewell, was a memory that he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The camp was alive with a new and a strange and an almost feverish energy when he returned. And at its very center, as always, was Dutch. He was pacing back and forth before the main fire, his eyes gleaming with a new and a brilliant and a dangerous light, his voice a rich and a powerful and a captivating symphony of grand promises and of beautiful and impossible dreams. And gathered around him, their faces a mixture of a desperate hope and a blind and an unquestioning devotion, were the members of his gang. "My friends," Dutch was saying, his arms spread wide as if to embrace the entire world, "the time for hiding in the shadows is over. A new and a glorious opportunity has presented itself, a plan so perfect, so beautiful, so final, that it will solve all of our problems. I have made a new and a powerful and an influential new friend, a man of great vision and of immense wealth, a businessman from the East named Mr. Burke. And he has presented us with a plan, a final and a glorious score that will give us everything we have ever dreamed of." Arthur's heart sank. He looked over at Hosea, who was sitting just outside the circle of the firelight, his face a mask of a quiet and a deep and a profound and a weary skepticism. Hosea caught his eye, and he gave a small and an almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent and a powerful and a final confirmation of Arthur's own deep and growing fears. And the object of their new and glorious plan? The gold reserves of Leviticus Cornwall's great mining operation near Blackwater, the very same operation that was run by a man named Hammond. The very same operation that Dutch himself, just a few weeks ago, had declared to be too dangerous, too well guarded, a fool's errand, a suicide mission. But now, according to Dutch, according to his new and mysterious friend, Mr. Burke, everything had changed. They now had inside information. They had a plan. A perfect plan. What do you think, dear listener? What happens when a leader, a man who has for so long been a symbol of vision and of hope, begins to value the beautiful and intoxicating music of his own grand promises more than the hard and the cold and the often difficult and disappointing realities of the world? It is a dangerous and a tragic and a deeply human kind of blindness. In the days that followed, the camp was filled with a new and a frenetic and an almost religious fervor. Dutch was a man possessed, his grand speeches growing more and more grandiose, his promises more and more extravagant. He spoke of a new and a better world, a world that was waiting for them just on the other side of this one, final, glorious score. And most of the gang, who were weary of running and of hiding, who were desperate to believe in something, in anything, were swept up in his powerful and beautiful and intoxicating vision. But Arthur and Hosea and a few of the others, like Charles and John, they watched from the sidelines, their hearts filled with a growing and a terrible and a quiet dread. They saw the madness that was beginning to gleam in Dutch's eyes. They saw the dangerous and the poisonous and the ever-present influence of Micah Bell, who was always at Dutch's side now, whispering his own dark and ambitious and self-serving counsel into the leader's ear. And they saw the great and beautiful and powerful and flawed and deeply human man that they had for so long loved and admired and followed, slowly but surely, beginning to lose his way, to lose his mind, to lose himself, in the beautiful and the intoxicating and the ultimately destructive and the terrible and the final and the all-consuming fire of his own grand and impossible and beautiful and tragic and deeply human dreams. The great and final storm was gathering on the horizon. And the entire and fragile and beautiful and tragic and doomed world of the van der Linde gang was now, unknowingly, standing directly in its path. In the tense and feverish days that followed, the van der Linde gang began to prepare for their great and final score. Dutch was a man possessed, his voice a constant and a booming and a beautiful and a terrifying symphony of grand pronouncements and of unshakable, self-assured faith. He spoke of the Blackwater gold not as a simple robbery, but as a great and a righteous and a final act of defiance against a corrupt and a changing world. It was to be their masterpiece, their magnum opus, the single, glorious act that would finally buy them their freedom, their paradise, their long-dreamed-of and ever-receding Tahiti. The camp was a hive of activity. Guns were being cleaned, ammunition was being counted, and horses were being shod with a new and a grim and a final purpose. But beneath this surface of bustling and hopeful preparation, the quiet and dangerous fissure of doubt that had opened in the heart of the gang was beginning to widen into a great and a gaping and an unbridgeable chasm. Arthur Morgan, his own heart a heavy and a troubled and a deeply conflicted landscape, found himself watching, observing, his old and easy loyalty now replaced by a new and a quiet and a deeply unsettling vigilance. He watched Dutch, and he saw a man who was no longer listening, a man who was surrounded only by the echoes of his own grand pronouncements and by the constant, poisonous, and fawning whispers of Micah Bell. He watched John Marston, a man who was trying, in his own fumbling and imperfect and deeply human way, to be a father and a husband, a man whose eyes were now filled with a new and a quiet and a desperate and a profound sense of a responsibility that extended far beyond the narrow and dangerous confines of the gang. And he watched Hosea, the old and wise and weary patriarch, his face now a mask of a quiet and a deep and a profound and a heartbreaking and an almost final sorrow, as he watched the great and beautiful and flawed and deeply loved man that he had ridden with for over 20 years, slowly but surely, beginning to lose himself in the beautiful and the intoxicating and the ultimately destructive and the terrible and the final and the all-consuming fire of his own grand and impossible and beautiful and tragic and deeply human dreams. And Arthur, in his quiet and restless and troubled wanderings, found himself drawn back, again and again, to the memory of that small and lonely homestead, and to the quiet and courageous dignity of Laura Vance. And so, while Dutch and the others were planning their great and final score, Arthur and John, in a strange and an unspoken and a deeply significant act of a shared and a quiet rebellion, decided to make one last ride to Valentine. Arthur needed to know that Laura and her son were safe, that they had reached the circuit judge, that the truth he had stolen for them had, in the end, been enough. And John, his own heart now heavy with the weight of his own small family, needed to see for himself what a different kind of life, a life that was built on something other than a grand and a beautiful and an ultimately empty promise, might look like. Their journey was a quiet and a somber one, the two men riding side by side, their conversation sparse, the weight of all the unspoken things that lay between them a heavy and a tangible presence in the air. And as they approached the outskirts of Blackwater, on their way to Valentine, a strange and an unsettling sight caught their eye. A new and a large and a suspiciously well-organized Pinkerton camp had been established just outside the town, its neat rows of tents and its disciplined and watchful guards a stark and a jarring and a deeply professional contrast to the chaotic and beautiful and ragged freedom of their own camp. "That's new," John muttered, his hand instinctively moving closer to the butt of his own gun. "And I don't like it." "Neither do I," Arthur replied, his own eyes narrowing as he scanned the camp, a cold and a familiar and a deeply unsettling feeling of being watched, of being hunted, beginning to creep up his spine. They decided to split up. John would continue on to Valentine, to see if he could gather any news of the circuit judge or of the Vance family. And Arthur, his heart now filled with a new and a terrible and a gnawing suspicion, would double back, to the small and now abandoned hotel where Dutch had first met with his new and mysterious and influential friend, Mr. Jefferson Burke. The hotel was empty now, its windows dark and silent, a ghost of a place. And Arthur, moving with the quiet and the practiced and the almost supernatural ease of a lifetime spent in the shadows, slipped inside. Burke's old room was just as they had left it, a place of a strange and a fleeting and a half-remembered luxury. And Arthur began to search, his hands moving with a quiet and a desperate and a methodical urgency, though he did not know, not really, what he was searching for. And then, he found it. Tucked away beneath a loose floorboard, a place of a hasty and a final and a secret concealment, was a small and a simple and a deeply incriminating tin box. And inside that box was a letter. It was written on official Pinkerton letterhead, its words a cold and a clear and a final and a terrible and a beautiful and a heartbreaking and an utterly damning confirmation of all his darkest and most unspoken fears. The letter was addressed to Mr. Burke. And it was signed by Agent Milton himself. And it read, simply, "Mr. Burke, your cooperation in the Van der Linde matter has been noted. Proceed with the plan. Draw them to Blackwater. The agency will handle the rest. Payment to be rendered upon delivery." The world seemed to stop. The air in the small and dusty and silent room grew thick and heavy, and Arthur could feel his own heart, a slow and a terrible and a final and a deeply painful drum, beating in his chest. Betrayal. It was a word that he had known his entire life. But this was a new and a different and a far more terrible kind of betrayal. This was not the simple and honest betrayal of an enemy. This was the cold and the calculating and the secret and the final and the absolute and the total betrayal of a man who they had been led to believe was their friend, their ally, their savior. Dutch's grand and beautiful plan was not a plan at all. It was a trap. A carefully and a brilliantly and a ruthlessly designed snare that had been set for them by the Pinkertons themselves, a snare that was designed to lead them, all of them, to their final and their bloody and their total and their absolute and their unceremonious end. But what do you think, dear listener, is the worst kind of betrayal? Is it the betrayal of a friend who turns out to be an enemy? Or is it the betrayal of a leader who, in his own pride and his own delusion, leads his family into a fire that he himself has helped to set? This was the terrible and the tragic and the profound and the beautiful and the deeply human question that now began to burn in Arthur Morgan's own weary and wandering and heartbroken and now finally and completely and totally and irrevocably awakened soul. As Arthur was reeling from his terrible discovery, John Marston, in the dusty and sun-baked telegraph office in Valentine, was making a discovery of his own. He was not looking for trouble. He was simply trying to send a small and a quiet and a coded message to a friend in another state, a message that was meant to inquire about a small and a quiet and a beautiful and a long-forgotten piece of land where a man and his wife and his son might one day be able to live in peace. But as he waited for the clerk to return, his eyes fell upon a series of freshly sent telegrams that were lying on the desk. And one of them, written in a stark and an official and a deeply chilling code, caught his eye. It was addressed to the new Pinkerton encampment outside Blackwater. And John, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the secret and the silent and the deadly language of the law, understood it immediately. "Burke, stop," the message read. "Gang taking bait, stop. Full force ready in Blackwater, stop. Terminate with extreme prejudice, stop. 2 men. 2 different places. 2 different pieces of paper. And 1 single, terrible, and undeniable truth." Their horses thundered through the night, their hooves a desperate and a frantic drumbeat against the hard and unforgiving earth as they raced back towards the camp, towards the family that they now knew, with a cold and a terrible and a final certainty, was walking blindly and trustingly and beautifully and tragically into a carefully and a cleverly and a ruthlessly laid snare. The storm was no longer gathering on the horizon. The storm was here. The horses thundered through the dark and silent night, their hooves a desperate and a frantic and a beautiful and a terrible drumbeat against the hard and unforgiving earth. Arthur and John rode side by side, their faces grim and set, the terrible and damning pieces of paper that they had found now tucked safely away, their weight a cold and a heavy and a final burden in their pockets. They rode not as outlaws on their way to a score, but as messengers, as prophets of a doom that was fast approaching, racing against the dawn, racing against the blind and beautiful and terrible faith of the man they had for so long called their father. The camp, when they finally burst into it, was a scene of a quiet and a focused and a deeply unsettling purpose. The last of the preparations for the great Blackwater score were being made. And Dutch, their charismatic and increasingly unpredictable leader, stood at its very center, his back to them, his arms spread wide as if to embrace the new and glorious day that was about to break. "Dutch." Arthur's voice was a ragged and a breathless and a desperate sound, a sound that cut through the quiet morning air like a knife. Dutch turned, his face at first a mask of a warm and a paternal and a welcoming surprise, a look that quickly soured into a cold and a hard and a deeply suspicious annoyance as he took in the sight of their lathered horses and their grim and desperate faces. "Arthur." "John," he said, his voice a low and a calm and a deeply and a chillingly controlled sound. "You're back. I was beginning to worry that you had lost your nerve. That you had lost your faith." "Dutch, listen to me," Arthur said, and he swung down from his horse, the incriminating letter clutched in his hand. "Burke. Burke's been playing you. He's been playing all of us. The whole thing, it's a trap." "A trap?" Dutch's laugh was a short and a sharp and a deeply dismissive sound. "My dear boy, of course it's a trap. Every bank, every train, every score we've ever taken has been a trap. That is the very nature of our profession. But we," he said, and he tapped his own temple with a long and an elegant and a deeply self-satisfied finger, "we are smarter. We have a plan. A perfect plan." "No, Dutch," John said, his own voice now a raw and an angry and a pleading sound as he too dismounted. "This is different. The Pinkertons, they're waiting for us. They know everything. Burke's been feeding them information from the very beginning." And he held out the crumpled and sweat-stained telegraph message, its stark and coded and deadly words a final and an undeniable and a terrible and a heartbreaking testament to the truth. But Dutch did not even look at it. His eyes, which had for so long been a source of a warm and a brilliant and a captivating light for Arthur, were now as cold and as hard and as distant as 2 dead stars. And in that single, terrible, and quiet moment, Arthur Morgan finally and truly understood. Dutch did not want to see the truth. He did not want to hear it. He had invested too much of himself, too much of his pride, and too much of his own beautiful and tattered and now finally and completely and utterly unraveling dream into this one, final, glorious score. And he was not about to let a simple and an ugly and an inconvenient thing like the truth get in his way. What do you do, dear listener, when the man you have loved and admired and followed your entire life, the man who has been your father in all the ways that truly matter, looks at you and sees not a son, but an enemy? What do you do when faith itself becomes the most dangerous and most blinding and most destructive of all possible traps? Faith, Arthur, Dutch said, his voice now a low and a soft and a terrible and a deeply sorrowful whisper. That is what I have always asked of you. That is all I have ever asked of you. And now, in this final and most important of all moments, you have lost it. This isn't about faith, Dutch, Arthur pleaded, his own voice now a raw and a desperate and a heartbreaking sound. This is about survival. This is about saving our family. Our family, a new and a sneering and a deeply unpleasant voice interjected. And Micah Bell stepped out from behind Dutch's tent, his own hand resting with a casual and a menacing and a deeply familiar confidence on the butt of his own gun. The only threat to this family, Arthur, he said, his smile a thin and a cruel and a reptilian thing, is the lack of faith. Your lack of faith. And the gang, which had been drawn by the sound of the raised voices, now began to gather, their faces a mixture of confusion and of fear and of a dawning and a terrible and an uncertain allegiance. Bill and Javier and some of the others, their loyalty to Dutch as absolute and as unquestioning as ever, moved to stand behind their leader. But Charles and Sadie and Mary Beth and Tilly, their own eyes now filled with a new and a quiet and a dawning and a terrible and a final understanding, slowly and deliberately moved to stand with Arthur and with John and with Hosea, who had now emerged from his own tent, his face a mask of a deep and a final and a profound and a beautiful and a heartbreaking sorrow, as he watched the great and beautiful and flawed and deeply loved man that he had ridden with for over 20 years, slowly but surely, beginning to lose himself in the beautiful and the intoxicating and the ultimately destructive and the terrible and the final and the all-consuming fire of his own grand and impossible and beautiful and tragic and deeply human dreams. The great and beautiful and tragic and doomed family of the Van der Linde gang was now, in this single, quiet, and terrible moment, quite literally and finally and irrevocably, drawing a line in the dust. Dutch, Hosea said, his own voice now a quiet and a tired and a final and a gentle plea. Listen to them, son. For once, in this new and crazy world, just listen. No, Dutch said, his voice now a roar, a sound of a pure and a wounded and a terrible and a final and a magnificent and a tragic pride. No. You listen. I have a plan. And it is a good plan. It is a plan that will save us all. He turned his back on them, on Arthur, on Hosea, on the two men who had been his brothers, his sons, his life, for over 20 years. And he looked at the men who still stood with him. Tomorrow, he declared, his voice once again a rich and a powerful and a beautiful and a terrifying and a final and a prophetic sound, tomorrow we ride to Blackwater. And anyone who does not ride with us, is against us. There is no middle ground. Not anymore. And as he walked away, with Micah smirking at his shoulder like some pale and bloated and triumphant parasite, Arthur knew that it was over. The family, the real family, the one that had been built on loyalty and on love and on a shared and a beautiful and a long-lost dream, had finally and completely and irrevocably collapsed. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here. And it was about to consume them all. The sun rose over a camp that was now a ghost of its former self. A profound and a heavy and a deeply sorrowful silence had fallen over the small clearing, a silence that was broken only by the quiet whisper of the wind in the tall pine trees and the distant, lonely cry of a circling hawk. The great, central campfire, which had for so long been the warm and vibrant heart of their community, was now just a pile of cold, gray ash. Dutch was gone. And with him, he had taken the faith, the loyalty, and the blind devotion of half of their family. They had ridden out at dawn, a grim and a determined and a tragically deluded procession, their faces set towards the false and glittering promise of the Blackwater gold, and towards the final, terrible, and waiting embrace of the Pinkerton's snare. Arthur Morgan stood and watched them go, his heart a cold and a heavy and a dead thing in his chest. He saw Hosea, sitting alone on a log, his head in his hands, his whole body slumped with the immense and the unbearable and the final weight of a lifetime of a misplaced and a beautiful and a tragic loyalty. He saw John, his face a mask of a quiet and a simmering and a helpless rage, as he checked and rechecked the action on his revolver, his hands moving with a restless and a nervous and a deadly energy. And he saw the women, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with a new and a terrible and a final and an unanswerable and a deeply sorrowful question. The family was broken. The great and beautiful and tragic and doomed dream of the Van der Linde gang, the dream of a life of freedom, of loyalty, and of a quiet and a final and a peaceful place called Tahiti, was now nothing more than a handful of cold and bitter ash. And then, in the distance, they heard it. A faint and a muffled and a terrible sound, a sound like distant thunder, that rolled across the plains from the direction of Blackwater. The sound of guns. Many guns. The sound of a battle. The sound of a trap being sprung. And in that moment, a choice had to be made. What do you do, dear listener, when the people you love, the family you have sworn to protect, have walked willingly into a fire of their own making? Do you let them burn? Or do you ride into the flames after them, knowing that you will almost certainly be consumed as well? For Arthur Morgan, for John Marston, for Hosea Matthews, there was no choice at all. It was not a matter of logic or of reason, it was a matter of the heart. These were their brothers. They were their family. And you do not abandon family. Their ride to Blackwater was not a ride of hope, but of a grim and a terrible and a final duty. They rode not to win, but to save what little could be saved from the wreckage. And as they crested the final hill overlooking the town, they saw a scene of absolute and total and utter chaos. The great Blackwater score had not been a score at all, it had been a massacre. The town was a swirling and a terrifying maelstrom of gunfire, of smoke, and of dying men. Dutch's gang was completely surrounded, trapped in a deadly and a brilliant and a ruthlessly efficient crossfire from the Pinkerton agents who were positioned on every rooftop and in every window. Arthur, John, and Hosea charged into the fray, their own guns now adding to the terrible symphony of the battle. They fought not with a plan, but with a desperate and a beautiful and a tragic fury, their only goal to create a path, a diversion, an escape route for the few who were still alive. And in the chaos of the battle, Arthur saw him. He saw Dutch. And Dutch was not fighting. He was standing in the middle of the street, his arms spread wide, a strange and a terrible and a magnificent smile on his face, as if he was conducting the great and terrible orchestra of his own destruction. And in that moment, Arthur saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw Hosea, the wise and the gentle and the good Hosea, fall, a Pinkerton bullet in his chest. And as the old man crumpled to the ground, something inside Arthur broke. The battle was now a desperate retreat. Arthur and John, with the few survivors they could gather, fought their way out of the town, their own bodies now a shield for the others. They left behind a scene of utter devastation. They left behind the bodies of their brothers. They left behind the shattered and the broken remains of the van der Linde gang. And they left behind the very idea of a life that had once seemed so full of promise, of freedom, and of an unbreakable loyalty. The guns of Blackwater were more than just the end of a robbery, they were the funeral for an era. They were the final, terrible, and bloody punctuation mark on a long and a beautiful and a tragic and a deeply human story, a story that was now, finally, at its end. In the quiet and somber days that followed the Blackwater massacre, the world had become a smaller and a much quieter place for Arthur Morgan. The great and beautiful and tragic and doomed dream of the van der Linde gang was now well and truly over, its grand pronouncements and its beautiful, impossible promises now just a faint and a bitter and a heartbreaking echo on the wind. The family was shattered, its members scattered to the four winds, each one now a lonely and a hunted and a desperate ghost, haunted by the memory of what they had once been, and by the terrible and final finality of what they had become. Arthur rode alone now, the great, open country his only true and constant and faithful companion. His body was weary, his soul was heavy, and the dry, rasping cough that now racked his chest was a constant and a final and a terrible reminder that his own time, his own long and bloody and beautiful and tragic story, was also nearing its end. He had lived his entire life by a code of loyalty to a man who had, in the end, betrayed everyone, including himself. And now, in the quiet and twilight of his life, he was searching for something new, for a different kind of code, a different kind of meaning. And his thoughts, in these final days, kept returning, again and again, not to the great scores or the famous gunfights, but to the small and quiet and dusty homestead in the valley, and to the memory of a brave woman and her young son. And he found himself riding back that way, one last time, not out of any sense of duty, but out of a quiet and a personal and a deeply human need to know. He needed to know that his one, small, and unnamed act of goodness had, in the end, been enough. He did not ride into the valley. He left his horse in the trees and he walked to the edge of the ridge, the same ridge from which he had first seen them so many weeks ago. And he looked down. And he saw a scene of a quiet and a simple and a beautiful and a profound and an almost holy peace. He saw Laura Vance, her back straight and strong, her movements sure and confident, as she mended a fence, the very same fence that he had once fixed for her. And he saw her son, Thomas, who was a little taller now, a little stronger, as he carried a bucket of water from the well, the very same well that Arthur had once cleaned for him. And on the porch of the small cabin sat a new and an older and a sturdy-looking man, a man with kind eyes and with gentle, working hands, and he was watching over the boy with a quiet and a loving and a paternal gaze. And as Arthur watched, the man stood up, and he walked over to Laura, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into him, her face filled with a quiet and a beautiful and a hard-won sense of peace. And Arthur Morgan, the outlaw, the thief, the killer, stood on that lonely ridge, and he watched them. He watched this small and beautiful and fragile and perfect picture of a life that he had helped to save, a life that he could never have for himself. And he felt something that he had not felt in a very long time. He felt a sense of a quiet and a profound and a deeply satisfying and a beautiful and a final and an almost sacred peace. He had not saved the world. He had not saved his gang. He had not even, in the end, been able to save himself. But he had saved this. This one, small, and beautiful thing. He reached into his own worn and tattered satchel, and he pulled out the small, crude, wooden horse that the boy, Thomas, had carved for him on that long-ago night. He held it in his rough and calloused hand, its simple and beautiful form a powerful and an eternal and a final symbol of a different kind of life, a different kind of legacy. It was not the grand and the glorious and the bloody legacy of an outlaw. It was the quiet and the small and the unnamed legacy of a good deed. A single, small, and beautiful spark of light in a long and a dark and a often brutal and a violent life. And as the sun began to set, painting the great western sky in brilliant and beautiful and final shades of orange and of red and of purple, Arthur Morgan turned and he walked away, his own shadow long and lonely behind him. He left no name. He sought no thanks. He was just a stranger, passing in the sunset. But in that one, small, and beautiful and unnamed act of goodness, in that one, single, quiet ember of hope that he had managed to protect from the great and consuming fire of his own life, he had, in the end, found his own small and quiet and beautiful and final redemption. And with that final thought, our long journey into the dusty and beautiful and tragic world of the American West, and into the heart of a man named Arthur Morgan, comes to its end. It has been a story of loyalty and of betrayal, of violence, and of a quiet and unexpected tenderness, and of the long and difficult search for redemption in a world that often seems to offer none. Now, let the echoes of the distant gunshots and the quiet whisper of the wind on the great plains gently fade into the quiet of the night. It is time for the outlaws and the heroes to rest, and it is time for you to rest as well. Good night, and have peaceful, honorable dreams.